So that's actually a good place now to head back to Cypress Point. And I've spent a little bit of time talking about some general basics with tee and green sites. Now we're going to be looking at land features and how to work them into routing. And Cypress Point is a fantastic choice for that. Let's just resume. So the main thing here is everybody knows holes 15, 16, 17 because those are the dramatic water ones. But a lot of the rest of the course, even the stuff we've already looked at, if we look at it now with a little bit of the Seminole perspective in mind, we can start to see how much this is incorporating the dune features and all of that stuff. And you'll see that now there's a little bit of this on my fictional stuff as well, that a lot of the greens are kind of clumped in interesting areas. If this works. So we're going to start with hole 3 here. So the main features, we have all the coastline stuff, and there's all these dunes of sorts that are running in this whole portion of the course, like in here. And now if we break it down, we can start to see just how many holes are using them. If we look at the actual routing here, 3 green is there, 4, 5 go off on the run. 6 comes back, green side at the base of the dune. 7 is almost in the dune. 8 plays over and around the dune. 9 green side is set in the high point of the dune. 10 tees off from the top of it. 11 green side sits right at the base. And hole 12 down here, if I get a better angle, winds around it. So of all these holes, and we can start looking here. Here we have 11 green, there's 6 green, there's 7 green, there's 9 green. And we have tees for 7, 8, 10, 12, all in the same area where there's the most interest going on. Exactly. 15 to 17 is kind of just goes off on its own. It's really disconnected from the rest of the course. But it's still using some awesome land. But in terms of general routing, sometimes you don't have a site where you have the luxury of doing something like that, where you have such a spectacular piece of land and you're really trying to say, okay, at this point, what do I want to do to get the most out of this? A lot of the time in this game, you actually have the opposite problem, which is I have so much here in front of me. I want to use a lot of this, but don't want it to feel like it's all over the place. So in terms of features then, we looked at hole 3 earlier, 7, 8, 9. 11 we didn't really look at too much. This green sits squarely in front of the dune, which is look you only have on 6 elsewhere on this course. And then hole 12, I talked about the tee shot on this course, on this hole, but I didn't talk about the green, which if you'll notice, almost has a little bit of the same thing going on as from hole 15 of Pacific Dunes. It sits kind of right in the valley of this, well 13 as well, kind of right where this dune would lead the eye to, but actually there's a good bit of space in between. So that as well, as in on 8, I don't think I mentioned that where the hole is positioned on the terrain also really comes into effect on how you play the tee shot. For those who are not going for the green, the fairway slopes very hard to the left and this way, just as the land would follow. 13 obviously is bay. It doesn't have as much going for the central dune feature, but it has a nice little ridge of its own out here that this green sits at the base of. And if you notice, 14 tees, not only 14 tees, but also 2 tees sit on top of here. This gives 14 a little bit more height heading out away. And if you just want to look at this green side on its own, this is another really nice green side. It just sits up there in the air a little bit of tree stuff behind it. I think the real course, these are even lower there, so it just looks like a canopy of trees almost mirroring the green. And then we get out to the famous 15 and 16. Here, this one just sits out in the water on its own, very dramatic. And then 16 arguably the most famous hole in all of golf, is this par 3. Unfortunately, you can't really put many more holes out here just because of what the land does, but we all know this hole. And you can see it's taking everything that's here. The green is kind of sitting in this little piece of land. This higher spot forms the tee for 17. We're really trying to take what we have here, and even though there's a lot of stuff going on, the designer of this course, Alistair Mackenzie, still chose to pick a lot of these land features and incorporate them more intentionally so into the fabric of this course. And that's something you'll see a lot of. That's one way to go about incorporating natural features. Another thing is something to do with water features. It's a little bit on a side note. I see a lot of newer designers doing this, especially with creeks and stuff, which is that water features that run perpendicular to the line of play tend not to be nearly as interesting because, in a sense, they limit options to purely distance-based. If they're angled a little bit off to the side, a lot of the times you have a bunch of different angles to choose from. The distance varies, so you kind of have to choose how much you want to bite off as well. They make the whole look more visually interesting as well, because it's not, okay, here I'm going to break things up vertically. It makes it easier to get the land flowing. So that's a big thing to keep in mind in terms of water features, streams, creeks, rivers, and that kind of stuff. Then there's another thing, which is both a routing thing and for visual interest with water features. And for this, we're going to head over to Yoho River by a certain Maddie from Canada. This is a very good course. I recommend you guys play it if you have not. But the main thing we're going to be looking at here is specifically holes 14 to 18. Hey DM Viking, how you doing? Hope you're doing well.
Hi there. Nice to see you again.
So right off the bat,
back up where we left off.
big view off the tee. That's not what we're here for. What we're here for is, and you can see it a little bit visually here as well, this river in the background. It's adding a little bit to this visual, not a ton though. But the main thing I came here for would be the closing 5 holes. And if you're wondering why these, it's because they all play along this river, for the most part. And not only do they all play along this river, the river is running along the right side of all of them. So most of the time that kind of spells disaster in terms of trying to work variety into your hole designs and visuals. Yes, whoever designed Yoho sucks, especially this baddie from Canada guy in my chat right now. He should just, get good. Just kidding, he's quite good. So this hole here, the river is much more prominent. It's kind of flowing right along the right side of this hole. It's very much in play. The fairway here kind of starts out left and then everything moves to the right following this river. And strategy-wise here, if you're not reaching this green in 2, for most pins on this, the way it is pitched quite devilishly and raised a little bit in front, you're best off trying to hang towards this right side of the fairway. And if you notice right here, the river's in play. So if you want this here easily, yeah, basically. 14 to 18 here, the variety is just, it's really good. So we have that. Then we come to 15. Creek's also on the right, but if you notice, it's used very different visually. This hole not only moves the complete other direction, but the creek is on the outside of the dogleg. It's still in play here on the tee shot, as a ball that's hit too far out can potentially run into the, or not the creek, river, can potentially run into the water. Yes. Sad match play noises. I feel very bad for, well, both of you. I can't read the other match that finished on hole 22, 4 of this course the second time. In the green site here, if you notice, you have a little bit of a low-key infinity visual behind this green. You have the waterfall feature in the background, which is as much so because of the height differential as he actually wanted it. I don't really condone using waterfalls too frequently if they're kind of trying to steal the show and stuff. I very much like using these kinds of features for them to just add subtly and feel like they belong as part of the course. Whereas you see a waterfall there, you're not thinking, "Oh, nice, someone put a waterfall there." It's like, yeah, it's just part of the course. That's my usual take on this stuff. It's much more towards a little bit of a naturalistic, slightly understated approach. So we have hole 16 here. Once again, the water is on the right. But here, if tee shot heads away from it, it's not really in play. And this is another kind of visual we haven't had in these holes yet. But this time, it's really in play on the approach shot. The green is very narrow, slopes hard toward the water, which means you don't want to miss left either. And it's just jammed up against the river here. This is quite a difficult hole. This is another relatively dramatic location for a green. And then 17 here, it's still there visually, but it's not in play at all. It's just kind of out there doing its own thing with 18 in the background. And then 18, it's sort of, but mostly not in play, but it's definitely part of this hole's visual framework, just in the right side of this hole. So that's the main reason I wanted to bring you all to this course. It's mostly about different types of land movement, varying the green sites, the teeing angles, the hole design strategically, and the visuals themselves, while using the same features. And I thought this was a particularly good example because of the fact that it does all that only using the river on one side. If you have holes crossing over the hazards, like I had on the course I showed earlier, it's a lot easier to get this kind of variety into it. You can also change kind of whether they run kind of close across, whether the hazard cuts through. Wrong button. I'm going to dip back into this for one quick second. And I am by no means saying that my course is the best example of this, because we're about to dip into what might actually be the best example of this that we have in the game. I'm going to dip back into this old course. But more with, oh come on, oh, it's defaulting there, I'm good. More with the creek usage in mind, because the front line plays very heavily around this. So the first hole we can see here, it's a little bit of, it's a cross hazard, very much splitting play, but if you notice, it's not just straight across, like you'll see from a lot of designers who are just getting their feet wet. That really limits interest here. Whereas here, you're not only getting to choose distance, you're also playing around a little bit with your approach angle into the screen, which based on where the pin is located, could very much change what you want to do. And then you have to decide, do I want to play a riskier tee shot, and if I make it, have a worse angle to some pins, better to others? Or am I better off playing safer, having a little bit of a distance penalty, but do I think having a better angle will make up for it a bit? All good, Scotty. See you later. And hello, Oshna. How you doing? So that's this hole. Number 2, it just runs alongside. Number 3 isn't actually on the creek at all, but it's sitting kind of in the hills above it. That's your introduction to this use for this on the course. 4, it's not really in play at all, but it crosses over and then goes up on the hillside above. 5 here, the creek runs left and then around, meaning it's still a hazard. This will probably be marked OB in the end, or some of this stuff might, left of the green. And then number 6 here. This hole's very unfinished, but this is going to be a tee shot where you're really deciding how much you want to bite off. Notice how it's going to be a little bit angled this way for the most part, kind of like 2 at Cypress that I went through at the beginning. And the approach shot here, the two creeks come together, and the green sits a little bit up from this side. So we've had 2 holes so far where the creek kind of gone from right to left. This one then 7. It's much more low profile compared to the other holes along it so far. Then it runs around the right. Then it ducks back in a little bit like on 1. Except on this hole, unlike 1, the best line of approach is more dictated by where on the green the pin is located. Here the entire green slopes very hard from left to right, and this is a 490-yard par 4. So you're going to have a much easier approach shot the more you flirt with this creek, And the farther you hit your tee shot, I think 300 is around right here, it starts cutting in gradually, so it gets a little bit harder to stay close to the creek. You have to be relatively courageous with your tee shots, or you have to have a very good red fast, which unfortunately a lot of the top players do. That's the idea with this hole. If you end up over here, you have a much more difficult approach angle. The entire green is going to be moving hard this way, and it's going to be relatively difficult to hold the putting surface at all, unless you're within 140 yards or so. So that's how that works. And then hole 8 doesn't really sit on the creek, but it's a lot like 3, and then it kind of rides these shelves above it, and then some other holes run down in the creek basin itself. That's how that works. So that's the way I chose to integrate this creek feature in. As I said before, disclaimer, I'm by no means saying this is the best way to do it. This is just a way to do it that is still showcasing some degree of variety. Doing pretty well, Oshna. Hope you are too. Sounds like you are. So we're almost done with this bit here. So we've went through some ways to get variety, using features in different ways. The next part is to keep in mind that a lot of the time you want to showcase areas of the course that are either a little more secluded or more open, or that kind of stuff. You want to give the player a little bit of a tour of the property. It's more important if you're creating a course that's on a relatively minimal piece of land. You really have to do your best to show how much is there. In a sense, you're being a salesperson. Whereas if you have a plot that has a ton of interesting land features, you might have to pick and choose a little bit to make sure it ends up being not only cohesive, but also doesn't kind of fatigue the player a little bit in the end by just throwing so much their way they can't take it all in. So a lot of the time, you can work around that by adding a lot of holes that go into little parts of the course. I don't think you would have noticed so much when I was talking through it, so maybe I should go back through it again. There are a couple spots on the course I was just showing you guys where there's a little bit of this going on. And then after that, we will duck into what, in my opinion, is the cream of the crop of fictional routings in this game, which would be Avery Fields. It's very hard to have any tutorial hard to do any tutorial with any aspects of routing and not reference Avery Fields at some point for fictional courses. Yeah, most of the uptime, probably all but the first 15 to 20 minutes or so. So now if we come back here, it's hard to tell because this doesn't have trees in it. There's no tree line here, but this almost sits off in its little own portion of the course. So you're kind of seeing this small area of the plot over here. And then number 2, this is a complete opposite. Here you start to see how open it really is. And then 3, you get a nice mix. Wherever the tee is going to be somewhere in this area, you have all the open plot off to the right. And the green site is going to have, I'm not sure how the trees are going to sit in the background yet, but the way it kind of comes up and sits almost with this mountainside, this part of the back is all going to be trees. So it's going to make the hole feel a little bit more closed in than it is, even if all the stuff in here is open. And if you remember, this is a little more advanced overall, but one way to hide, you can call it negative space or open space, empty space, whatever you want to call it. If you just have it in an elevation where it doesn't show to the player, you don't see all that space behind. You just think, oh, the green's there, and then you have this mountain sitting behind it. You don't even know there's a creek 150 or 200 yards away from the green that the land goes down to. So there's that kind of stuff. And then this over here is another instance where the course, you kind of come up and over into this little area of the course where you have a bunch of green sites all in one spot. And 12 here, there are going to be trees all in this area. It feels a little bit closed in as is. It will be much more so when it's done. And 13, 14 is all on its own. 15 isn't going to be that closed in. But then 18 you come back to at the end, which kind of just sits, it's going to sit in its own little gully area. This is inspired by the 18th hole at Ballyhack, which is the main inspiration for this course. And for the 18th hole there, they actually had a steep creek valley that they kind of bulldozer filled a bit and moved the land around to create something that it still looked very natural in the end, but it wasn't at all. It was highly artificial, actually. But it has a similar feel to this. And the green site itself is higher up on that hole. And also while it was crazy, and this is not finished, it was a lot crazier than this, with a very distinct kind of trough in the green right through here that this does not have. Whereas the general land feel, I wanted to borrow from that some on this. So that's an example of, parts of this course feel very open, some parts feel relatively closed off and on their own. So that's another way to add variety. And that's something that Dylan Bronson mentioned to me that I got from Andrew Green as thinking about holes as quote-unquote rooms, hallways, and straightaways. And all that really means is, and there's nothing too specific about this, is that for rooms, it's all closed off. Either you can have trees or something on 3 sides of the hole. Feels like it's in its own little space. Kind of like the green site for one on that course would be like that. Hole 18 has a little bit of that, but that's more a hallway because it's kind of open at the end. It's only got stuff on 2 sides. And then straightaway would be just open visuals on all sides, or on all but closed in on no more than one side. So it feels like the hole just goes straight out. That's not super important to have in mind consciously, but just keep in the back of your head that varying a lot of the ways a hole feels in terms of how open or closed in it is another great way to add variety and a sense of flow to a golf routing. And it also keeps things visually a lot more interesting.